Mwiriwe, good day, Makadi Abarizenu. I'm sorry to not be with you in person. The irony is not lost on me, colleagues, that we often talk, as I'm about to do, about Africa's climate futures without being in the same room and at the same table. Yet the story of Africa's response to climate change requires collective reflection for it to be inclusive, more sustainable, and more resilient. Even for those of us who are one step removed from nature in our present-day lives. Looking back at the places we called home as we were growing up as children can reveal very disturbing truths. This is certainly true for me. I grew up in a small mining town called Kadoma in Zimbabwe. And as soon as school was out, my parents would bundle me off to Mondoro, a rural area to the west. I loved it in Mondoro. In fact, I had my first crush on a girl in Mondoro. I recall how the surrounding forests were lush, teeming with wildlife. Rivers were bountiful, full of fish and fowl, and the pristine, fresh African water. I have many fond memories of swimming and catching fish in Mondoro. City folk like me went back home with our hands full of the gifts from nature and the agricultural bounty that we got from the rural areas. That's because forests of Mondoro were able to give, and we gratefully received. Today, however, when I return to my village in Mondoro, my heart breaks. The lush forests and wildlife are gone, replaced with barren fields and some whimpering stream where the river once ran. I now bring my own food and bottled water whenever I visit. And worst of all, the people of Mondoro, who I had always associated with nature's abundance, are today very poor and disenfranchised and have very few, if any, options for bettering their lives. Tragically, colleagues, the story of my village is shared by thousands of villages across Africa that are suffering the worst impacts of climate change, and to an extent, population growth and harmful development choices. This is not inevitable. Africans can adapt to the worst impacts of climate change. Africans can also contribute to global effort to transition to a low carbon economy. But for that to happen, there is increasing recognition that the transition to a low carbon economy in Africa must be just. As things currently stand, the ongoing transition is anything but just, and the odds are heavily stacked against African countries. In fact, at the climate conference of the parties in Glasgow, Africa needed to see commitments that hold global warming at no more than 1.5 degrees. African countries called for more mitigation ambition from developed countries. African countries demanded recognition for their natural capital as a global good with compensation schemes for sequestered carbon. African countries further put forward plans for mobilizing private sector investments for green economy and climate action, such as the SDG 7 initiative. If that happens, the world would have taken an important step towards according Africa a fairer outcome. But that is not all. Africa risks being left behind or having to put up with solutions that are not ideal for the continent. Unless we double down on defining what a more just transition could look like and follow that with sustained diplomacy, Africa's future is looking very bleak. And if Africa is to define solutions for a more just transition, UN institutions such as the Development Program of the United Nations, must now help the African countries to work out what a just transition could look like. UNDP Africa Office is especially well placed to ask questions and find solutions about Africa's transition. That's why today's panel is so incredibly important. But to kickstart that conversation, we must acknowledge three facts. First, the current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions is problematic for everyone. A recent United Nations Environment Programme report indicated that as of 2019, annual emissions stood at 52.4 gigatons. Now, to put that into context, in order for us to stay below the 2-degree target, we still have to reduce annual emissions by 37 gigatons and achieve an annual emissions target of 15 gigatons by 2030. So we are way off base here. We are way off the mark. Second, Africa's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is very small. It's 3%. To be sure, Africa has very little historical responsibility for climate change. And the fact that it continues to suffer the greatest burden of climate change today is unacceptable. Third, energy is an important ingredient to modern growth and development prospects for any country. And at just close to 40% access to energy, African countries remain significantly low on their prospects for development. The lowest in the world. If Africa is to expedite its economic growth, then this trajectory must be turned around. And a solution to Africa's energy problems and energy access must be found soon. In fact, energy access has created the most controversy in the just transitions debate, and for good reasons. Questions remain on a number of issues, including whether Africa should be spared the ban on fossil fuel developments, because such a ban would undermine economic development prospects for Africa, and it would deepen the poverty crisis on the continent. But there are also questions relating to whether there is a trade-off, or to use the administrator's preferred characterization, whether there is a choice to be made between provision of green energy and growth potential for Africa. And again, there are other questions on whether acting on carbon emissions is effectively a tax or limitation to economic growth potential. And finally, whether developed nations should recognize that as things currently stand, Africa is already sequestering more carbon than it is emitting. And therefore, whether there is a debate to be made here, or whether there's a point to be made about whether developed nations should support Africa with its energy transition, or should allow Africa to use its fossil fuel abundant resource as a transitional fuel to accelerate energy access on the continent. There have been talks about whether gas should be developed on the African continent as a transitional fuel, and whether in fact developed nations should not be punitive to Africa if that be the case. Colleagues, if we are to avert the worst climate crisis in Africa, a new deal must emerge out of Egypt. And that deal must transform the way we produce our food, the way we choose what we consume, the way we develop our infrastructure, including our cities, our roads, our housing and our dams, the way we produce energy, and the way we value nature in our economic systems. Farmers, like those from Mondoro, will also need access to the best available information, the best available science, and the best available solutions. That is a deal that we owe them, and the many people who call Africa their home. I hope that through the efforts of the UNDP family that's gathered here, and through the efforts of each and every one of you in this room, and each and everyone who is watching this message, one day when I return to Mondoro, it will more closely resemble the place that I grew up in and loved as a child. Thank you.